Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel and the next episode of Game Mechanics. It has been a while. This is where I take a look at various different features and mechanics in video games and analyze them from an amateur's point of view, in an effort to get a better understanding of why they work, and how they help the developer convey what they want to the player. I also look at how they affect the player as well. And today we're going to take a look at one that, in the scheme of things, is both older and newer than a lot of things I've covered before, and that's video game physics. Physics is, at its core, the study of matter, motion, and energy, and their effects on the things around them. As far as games are concerned, we're looking at how the player can interact with the world around them in a more real or fantastical way. It could be as simple as being able to bump a trash can, the movement of hair, which, while that sounds simple, is anything but in video games, all the way to large-scale explosions and their effect in the world that you're in. Most of us take this kind of interaction for granted because it feels normal, and honestly it is. It's very normal to expect that if you hit something, you might damage it or move it. If something explodes, it will do damage to the things around it and move them through the force created. But this wasn't always the case. In many early games, the backgrounds were pretty much static objects. Explosions didn't affect anything around them save enemies, and that primarily just did damage, or set up a chain reaction of explosions because, well, that's what it was. The game had no way of knowing how an explosion should affect the world in any meaningful way. There was no programming that told it how this one event should affect the other things around it. But right now, we're actually getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to a moment and look at a very early physics example in games. How far back does this go, and how did these things work before we had all these advanced engines that allowed us to really interact with the world around us and the way we involve in games today? Well, let's find out. This story starts, as many of the stories start on this channel, with Pong. Yeah, I know a few of you saw my previous video and you're not surprised, and other of you are laughing at me right now. But it makes sense when you think of it. If you're going to program something with collision detection and how an object interacts with the world in a 2D plane, it's a good place to start. It's simple, basic geometry. The ball hits the paddle and it goes off in another direction. The relative speed you're traveling in that direction can change the angle and speed of the ball as it travels back. If it comes in contact with another object, like a wall, on either side, it'll change its angle again, and sometimes sharply, sometimes wide, and varying in speed, based on how hard it was redirected by the player. Boys and girls of all ages, we have basic physics in 1972. I'll admit it's not as sexy or as fancy, but it works. Let's move forward a bit though, to Mario. Be it in Donkey Kong or Super Mario Bros., they both influenced a lot of what came to be in future games. These games had a heavy focus on momentum, jumping, and the effect of gravity on the characters and objects in a 2D space. Running would build up momentum that could translate into a higher jump or a longer jump. Jumping itself could have a set amount of distance that could be incorporated, implying the effect of gravity. However, how much does gravity affect a character? How far can they jump? How fast can they run? These are all things that developers would have to figure out when designing the game, often tailoring it for each game. Other times developers would ignore tradition and might come up with something that might just allow the players to do things like, say, double jump, perhaps. Let's take a look at the Metroid series for a second and look deeper at how some of the jumping mechanics work in this game. Why jumping again, you ask? Well, it's a basic motion done in almost all video games and can affect how you interact with the game quite a bit. Why Metroid, you ask? Well, that one's even easier. It has multiple modifications to your jump, you see. You start out with a basic jump, basically allowing you to press the button for just a moment and you'll do a small hop. Pressing it for longer will give you a longer, higher jump, but it's just an average jump for the game in the scheme of things. As you progress, you find your first upgrade known as the high jump boots. These allow Samus to put more force into her jumps, getting more height. This is a base modification to the physics of the game, changing the game's rules to allow her to reach higher and more out-of-the-way locations. Further in still, the player gets what's known as the screw attack. Any Metroid fan will tell you this is almost always one of the last abilities in the game, since it pretty much breaks the game entirely. In the first game, it allowed her to basically kill almost anything instantly when she came in contact with it. In later titles, once Samus got this and the space jump, she could jump, not only kill everything in her way, but basically stay in the air indefinitely so long as the jumps were timed properly. Now imagine if you removed one or more of these mechanics out of the game. With the screw attack gone, you could still finish the game, because it's mostly an optional extra for completionists in most games. However, the high jump itself is required in most games it's in. Not only that, so is the space jump. You also can't get to certain areas if you don't have one or more of these, but often you can't escape at the end of the game either. Why have any of these at all in the game, you ask? Part of it's just the sense of empowerment, the character discovering new areas and getting new abilities for it. The other is the sense of fun. By adding these new movement abilities, they change the feel of the game and continue to challenge the player to think in new ways and react to the game's physics in new and challenging ways to basically make them rethink their strategy and to make the game feel fresh again. It's a good method for changing and varying physics in the game, primarily because the character begins as someone more akin to the level of Mario with a standard mechanic that one would expect. Then over time, that expectation is subverted by giving the player more and more powers attached to the suit to assist with the mechanic. In this way, the player has time to learn the base jumping mechanics in the game and can more readily and easily adjust to the flexibility of the new height mechanic as the game goes on. This game gives greater playability and allows the developers to hide things in locations that the player would otherwise not be able to reach. It adds to the engagement of the game, all thanks to how the actual manipulation of gravity affects the player as it's changed progressively in the game by combining three things in succession: physics, jumping as a mechanic, and power-ups. This isn't the only way physics is used in 2D games. It can also be used on projectiles. Some have different ranges, some have different arcs, and speaking of arcs, Angry Birds comes to mind in this particular aspect. Angry Birds is a great example of a simple game made interesting by the physics involved. The entire game is focused around flinging your little birds at various different fortresses the pigs have devised. The better you judge the arc and aim, the better you score. Each bird has its own arc, and some even have special abilities that you can use to either split them into more of themselves, dive faster, go harder, explode, various different things like that. Playing the game is simplicity itself, but brilliant in its challenge at the same time, which is why it's been such a hit through the years, and especially in the mobile game market, spawning off numerous sequels, and even one based off Star Wars that would have gravity wells in the space that would alter how your bird flew. Another example of this kind of gameplay is World of Goo. This is an older game released in 2008 that was focused around using small little balls of goo that form various different structures. The main idea being that make one stable enough that you could reach the exit on the other side of the stage. It sounds simple, but gets pretty complicated very fast. And you have to make sure that the way you connect your blobs is structurally sound enough that it doesn't collapse in on itself. This makes for an interesting physics-based puzzle game that challenges the player to design a structurally sound object that can withstand the weight needed to get from one spot to the other and not succumb to gravity. All of this obviously applies to the 3D realm as well, with one of the earliest examples being Half-Life 2, which we've talked about on this channel in the past. This made excellent use of the Havoc engine, which was one of the earliest physics engines used in a 3D game. This allowed projectiles to break objects in realistic ways, and even have explosions do damage to surrounding objects by applying force, causing them to break and move in more realistic ways. This was a new concept when it came out. Before this, objects were either coded to explode or just do damage, basically being unaffected by anything the player did directly. Glass wouldn't shatter, boards wouldn't break, and nothing can be moved in any way by the player. By adding this in, Valve literally changed the 3D space and how the player interacted with it, causing an overall explosion in physics coprocessors, physics engines like the PhysX engine. Honestly, this is what allowed fluids to flow in more lifelike manners, particle effects to move in more realistic ways to allow dynamic destruction of the game's environments. All of these adds brought more realism and by extension immersion into the game worlds. They feel more real because of the way the world around the player works. Because it acts more like the real world, the player feels more engaged. It becomes more relatable and more believable by extension. So what all have we learned by looking at physics in video games so far? First, they can be used to change up the basic game mechanics like in our Metroid example. By changing the way gravity affects the player or giving them a way to break those physics, the player can reach new areas, find new approaches to combat, and change how they look at the entire game as a result. Secondly, they can be used to make entire game types as shown in our Angry Birds and World of Goo examples. You can take the physics and make them front and center, a total keystone to the entire game system. In this way you can challenge the player to understand how those physics work and manipulate them, or even break them, in new and interesting ways in order to make the game have more replayability, or just challenges for the player as they work to solve and overcome what the developer has in store for them. They can also be used to make the world feel more real and lifelike. By giving the players more agency over the world, the developer can open up new avenues and angles to reach a given goal. They can add all new challenges that require clever use of the environment or the game's physics objects in order to overcome the challenges presented in the game. Sometimes developers can use these physics engines deliberately to make things that don't work like conventional physics as well. A good example of this is something like Totally Accurate Battle Simulator, which is honestly anything but. In this game, you set up two armies to confront one another. As the battle commences, you'll see the ragdoll units move towards each other in a stumbling walk. You'll often laugh as the wild physics fling the units through the air, as others trip over some of the other units, all while the carnage ensues. This type of over-the-top physics reactions make for some truly hilarious moments in video games, as the two armies collide again and again, vying for dominance on the field of battle. Another example of this kind of game that uses truly odd physics is I Am Bread. Yeah, you heard that right. In this game, you're quite literally a piece of bread that is trying to navigate its way through the stage. Would you have never seen a sentient piece of bread before? What? It's totally normal. The idea is to find a way to make yourself toast in some manner in the stage. To that end, you can move your piece of toast around the board, flipping, wiggling your way over objects, falling onto the floor, and even climbing over various different things that get in your way on your way to becoming the ultimate representation of bread. Toast. Games like this have not only been made truly possible by the advancements of physics in video games, giving us all new creative types of games for players to explore, and allowing developers to really exercise their creativity by thinking outside the box, and how objects should truly interact with each other. Sometimes the things that happen aren't intended. Players will often find unique ways and gameplay mechanics that break the physics in the games themselves. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are full of really creative and odd uses of the game's world and abilities that allow you to genuinely kind of break the physics of the game itself. One such example is the minecart trick in Breath of the Wild. By stacking two minecarts just so, and with careful maneuvering, Link can quite literally use magnetism to lift the carts with him inside it and fly across the world in the game. Sometimes things like this will get patched out as they're totally unintended. Other times, the developers will leave these things in the games as it adds flavor and character to the game, and they personally enjoy seeing what the players do with the way the game physics work almost as much as the players themselves enjoy finding fun and new ways to exploit how the game world's rules work. So in a way, the very physics of the game can actually determine how much or how little fun the player has with it. Taking an average open world game and making it into something extraordinary, or taking what could be something immensely fun and creative and bogging it down in limited things that you can interact with or manipulate in the world. Both are valid depending on the type of game world and story you're trying to tell, inside that world and should often be exploited as such. However, what do you guys think of this particular mechanic? How often do you actually pay attention to the level of physics in a game? How many of you look for ways to deliberately break the physics in the game and do wild stuff on them? How important is it to you to be able to exploit physics in the game, not only to manipulate things and solve puzzles, but to gain an advantage on an opponent? What are some of your favorite physics effects in games and favorite games with wonky physics? Let me know in the comments. For now though, thank you so much for getting this far in the video. I always appreciate it when you guys take time out of your day to watch anything I make, but I especially enjoy it when you take time and check out the Game Mechanic series. It's one of my personal favorites to write and think about. If I could ask you for one more favor, please leave this video a like, and share it out if you think this series is interesting enough. Also, if you haven't, consider subscribing. That actually helps me out a ton. For now though, thank you once again for spending part of your day with me, and until we meet again, happy gaming.